Welcome to Let's Talk Passion and Purpose with Nicole Thomas. I'm your host, Nicole Thomas, and this is the podcast where visual artists, writers, and creative visionaries share the stories behind their work, their passion, and their purpose. Here you'll find real stories, real passion, and real purpose. Let's get started.
To me, there's a friction there between, I've got this world of the poem that sort of exists outside, but I'm also, sort of gesturing towards the reality of lived events, and how do those things connect, and how do you create sort of an authentic speaker and create an authentic experience for the reader.
Today I'm joined by Patrick Swaney. Patrick is the author of Hand Over the Edge of the World, and his poems have appeared in Boulevard, Conduit, the Indiana Review, and elsewhere. He's an associate professor of English and writer-in-residence at Catawba College and lives in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. In this episode, we discuss the long journey to Patrick's debut poetry collection, how to find and trust your creative voice, and what it looks like to live a creative life in the middle of everyday responsibilities. This episode is for writers, poets, and creatives who are balancing everyday life while staying committed to their creative work. Patrick, welcome to the show. So excited to have you with us today.
Thanks, Nicole. I'm super excited to be here. Yeah.
Awesome. Let's dive right in. When people introduce you, they usually mention your accomplishments, professor, poet, author. But if we stripped everything away, every title, who is Patrick Swaney?
Man, we are jumping right in because that's kind of a tough question
It's a
to.
loaded question, right? And I said, we'll start from the beginning.
It's a big one. Yeah. So, I mean, I'm tempted to replace those titles with other labels, right? Like I'm a dad and a stepdad and a brother. But I think those seem kind of insufficient as well in some ways. So I think, like a lot of people, I'm kind of in continually sort of trying to figure out, you know, what matters or what to pay attention to or where to give my energy, right? It's kind of like an ongoing process in that way. Um, and I think, I feel lucky to have writing in that regard because that is sort of an outlet, a way of kind of processing the world for me, right? Sort of making sense or figuring out kind of, what an experience or an event or a feeling was, right? As you sort of write it out. And if it's not writing, it's just sort of, the creative process itself that I think is maybe, you know, I don't know if it's most me, but I feel most kind of happy when I'm doing, that. Of course, there's all the sort of frustrations that can come with writing or creating or anything, but being in that process is a big part of who I am, I think.
Yeah, I can tell just based on what you express. So we always have these titles, especially the labels tied to what we do. But then there's the being there, the dad, the stepdad.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering what role does creativity, because you just touched on it briefly, what role does creativity play in the way that you show up in the world?
Oh man, I think it's just sort of part of how I engage with the world, right? Like I'm not in terms of my creative process, I'm not necessarily a writer that kind of has a routine that writes every day, right? There's kind of that myth of the writer. Like if you're going to be a writer, you need to sit down at your desk at this time and write this number of words and kind of have this regiment. And that's never quite made sense to me. So when I am writing, or even when I'm not writing, I try to sort of have that, I guess, curiosity, right? Sort of awareness to the world and engage with it in that way. In some ways, I'm kind of always looking at the world through the eyes of a writer, possibly. Not to, I hope not in like a crass way of how can I use this, right? But kind of being open to the possibilities of kind of what's happening and how I'm experiencing it or how the experience exists for those around me.
Absolutely, that makes sense. You've always been steeped in the literary world. When did your love for words and writing in the creative space start?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, it feels like it's been a part of me for a long time, right? Growing up in elementary school, I was actually part of some program called Young Authors, where I was, got to sort of produce these books. And I think we went to the local college and sort of got to do a reading or something like that. So there was that encouragement from the beginning. And I remember my best friend or one of my friends in second or third grade, Danny Garza. Shout out to Danny Garza. But he and I would. It seemed like we had a lot of time in class to just write stories for whatever reason. Maybe that's just me remembering it now, but we would have these competitions almost to who could write like the longest story, and we'd keep it going in some way, right? So it was there from sort of a young age, this sort of encouragement or this possibility that you write, right, in some way. Um, but I don't know that that doesn't mean I ever thought of it necessarily as what I would do, right? So, as I grew up, in high school, I got interested in other things, played sports, and then kind of eventually came back around to it. Yeah.
So tell us about the evolution from, a young age and still participating in sports and other activities that to
Yeah.
where you are today. Was it linear or
Sure. So, I mean, I went to undergrad I thought I was going to become an engineer, actually. I applied and was accepted to the engineering school at the University of Michigan. I was like, I'm going to go be an engineer. I don't think I even knew what that meant exactly. Maybe I still don't know what engineers do, honestly, but I was accepted to the engineering program. That was sort of my path, right? And it turned out once I got there, I spent a lot of my time, in these kind of math classes and lectures. I was oftentimes, instead of taking notes, writing little poems on on my notepad. And so eventually, after some sort of struggling along in that program, I became an English major. I took a creative writing class. And found it was something that kind of rekindled my love, I guess, of writing. And from there, it was kind of I've just found ways to kind of keep doing it. And for me, that meant a lot of school and then some more school and then some more school after that was sort of my path. So I kind of continued finding ways to keep writing as a central part of my life.
was there a moment when you realized that this wasn't going to be a hobby? What and I guess the question really is what kept you going on the path? Because a lot of us say we want to write and then
Yeah,
it really becomes a hobby or it's a
right.
passion that we just don't have time to pursue because of life.
Yeah. I mean, part of that was sort of having the opportunity and being able to sort of continue being a student and continue learning. Because I think I had sort of when I started out, I mean, I don't think I was a very good writer, right? I just knew that it was something I wanted to do. So being able to sort of be a student and continue in these programs, I did a master's program and then an MFA and then a PhD program. And not that that has to be a writer's path, but for me, it kind of made sense. And I had a lot of great teachers along the way. A lot
Mhm.
of at each stop, there was somebody that sort of opened my eyes to something new. But by the time I was in my MFA program, I remember there was a great faculty at University of North Carolina, Wilmington, but we had a visiting poet who was there for a semester, Jack Myers, who is a great poet and just a great guy. And it turned out that this was his last workshop. He passed away sort of soon after he had visited us there. But I remember I had a conference with him, and some of the poems. I was writing some of the poems in this book at the time, and he had told me that that he thought I had found my voice in terms of a writer in some of these poems. And I don't think I'd had that sort of kind of direct kind of I guess praise or encouragement from a teacher. There are various ways that teachers kind of open your eyes and introduce you to different things and encourage you to keep going. But I think that kind of meant a lot to me at the time and sort of gave me confidence. Even though I was well into my writing student days, it still kind of stuck with me.
Yeah, it's nice when someone recognizes the talent in you and
Yeah.
then
You feel seen, kind of, right?
yeah, you
Yeah. And
definitely
you,
feel seen
you
and
don't always have
validated.
that recognition. Yeah.
No, you don't. You don't. So that's wonderful. And here we are today. You have your new collection,
Yeah.
poetry collection, prose poetry, the title Hand Over Hand, Over the Edge of the World.
Yes. Yeah. It's a mouthful, right? It's kind of,
It is a mouthful. And I was thinking, wait, do I have that correct? Even though I have the book and I really love some of the pieces because I'm just getting started reading your
thank you.
work. But the title immediately caught my attention. Where did that title come from? And
Yeah.
yeah.
That's a good question. I find myself sometimes apologizing for the long title. I'm like, it's a long title, but I should get out of that habit. But yeah, so there's a poem in there that's about halfway through the book called Hand Over Hand.
Mhm.
Um, I should have looked it up earlier to find out where it actually is at the end of the second section. And I realized when I was giving a reading recently that the phrase hand over the edge of the world actually does not appear in the poem, but there's a moment where a character in this poem, kind of disappeared in the distance as if he was climbing over the edge of the world. And
Wow.
so I think I always had the phrase hand over the edge of the world in my head. It just kind of never made it into the poem itself. But when it
Mhm.
came time to, name the manuscript, and there were other options that, I cycled through a few sort of titles throughout the process of this, but that's the one that kind of stuck and seemed to make sense. And I think it does fit the collection. Um, in the way that it's kind of both kind of a literal image in some way, but also slightly strange. And I think a lot of the poems in these collections do both of those things in the narratives they present.
I have to agree because I've
Yeah.
read a few and they are quite interesting. Definitely will pique your interest. I want to ask you a couple of questions before we delve into hopefully you sharing some of your work. How long did it take you to write your manuscript?
Yeah, so that's a good question. It's a little hard to measure because a number of these poems were written almost, 10 plus years ago. And then, there was the revision and editing and adding and taking away process over that time. So it was kind of a long journey for this book. It was part of it was in my MFA thesis, and then another part of it, I wrote some more of the poems in my PhD program, and then I went back to it and added and revised as I went. But it did, so it was really, to put sort of a date on it is difficult or a number on it, but it did sort of, take a long time, right? It was kind of a journey for this book.
Patrick, why now? Because you have years of experience studying, honing your craft. Why now? Why this particular book?
That's a good question. In some ways, it's the the luck of the sort of poetry publishing industry, right? I had a version of this book, that I was submitting and sort of getting it out there and submitting to contests or open calls to, that publishers put out for poetry, and it had had some success, right? It had been named a semifinalist or even a finalist for a contest, but never really sort of gotten picked up, right? Never kind of gotten over the hump. And so I put it away for a while, right? Like I thought like, well, this poem, I was working on other poems at the time. I had sort of moved on. I was like, well, this manuscript, maybe it's just not going to do it. I sort of, put it in the figurative drawer, I guess.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm.
and there was kind of an offhand comment from a friend of mine who's a writer who had I wish I could remember more exactly what he said, but he mentioned that he really liked some of those poems, some of those prose poems that I've been writing, right? And he sort of said he hoped that I was still submitting that manuscript. And I was like, oh well, I don't know. I don't feel like those poems are what I'm doing right now, right? And but then that kind of comment stuck with me, and I think it might have even taken a year or so. And I was like, you know what? Yeah, those poems are good, right? Like I went back to it and kind of pulled it back out, went through the sort of revision process again. I was like, I should send this back out, right? And I think I was just fortunate enough to find the right publisher at the right time, and it got picked up.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Wonderful. Congratulations again.
Yeah.
And so, for someone picking up Hand over the edge of the world for the first time, is there one poem you'd invite them to begin with?
So I think how to choose. I mean, I hope it's not too much of a cop out to say the first poem, Search Party. I think that's a poem that kind of I mean, because it is the first poem, I sort of selected it for a reason as the first poem, but kind of sets the tone for the collection, right? It's got a lot of the sort of stylistic elements that kind of open the collection, like a narrative, a sort of situation that, heads in a direction that's a little unexpected after seemingly being kind of familiar. All right, search party. The search party found his disappearance disappointing. It was over within an hour when the boy was spotted in plain sight on a park bench, humming and happy, with a magnifying glass around his neck and a balloon in his hand. This just won't do, the search party said. The boy looked up at the faces surrounding him, then looked up at his balloon. I'm not supposed to talk to people I don't know, he said, swinging his feet. It's like you were barely missing at all, the search party said. Perhaps you need more time, a head start. Are there mine shafts near here? Uncovered wells? You could be swept down river, maybe hitchhiking. Do you know any strangers? They were excited now with the possibility of salvaging the search. But it's up to you. Make it a surprise. Make it dangerous. We'll close our eyes. We'll count to 100. We won't peek. I probably should go home, the boy said, hopping down from the bench. No, don't tell us, the search party shouted. We'll find you. But the boy was already crossing the street, his balloon bobbing behind him. We'll find you, they repeated, and closed their eyes as they began to count.
Yeah. Oh, I love this space. What is the message you want readers to take away? Is there one overall message?
I don't know that there is an overall message I'd like readers to take away from the book. I think, you know, reading it, there are, certain themes that recur, right? There's this sort of like, you know, sort of expectations or, characters or the narrator being kind of like confronted with realities that are a little misaligned to their expectations, right? And they have to figure out what to do with that, right? Either kind of like adapt or resist, right? And I feel like that, you know, happens to us in life as well, right? But I know as a reader, I'm looking for, something that when I read poetry or fiction, I'm looking for something that maybe I both recognize, but that is also kind of unfamiliar, right? Or sort of defamiliarizing, helping me see something that I recognize in a new way. And I hope that's what these poems do. If a reader can connect with one or more of them or the whole collection and sort of see something from a slightly new perspective or make them think about, something in a new way as they connect with the work, I think that would be a success. Yeah.
That's what success looks like, really changing viewpoints of the reader. It's been said that you're interested in the space between lived experience and the poem. Can you tell us what that means and what draws you to that idea? Why is that idea
Sure.
so prominent for you? Mhm.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, so I am interested in this idea of like the world of the poem and then sort of the world of lived experience, right? Like, I think with any art form, especially with poetry, it sort of exists obviously within the world of lived events, right? Like I'm writing poems, I'm doing this thing, but there's also this artifact that is a poem, right? And poetry especially kind of announces itself as like, hey, you're reading a poem now, right? Like you're going to be in the space of this poem. And people bring all sorts of kind of expectations to their reading of a poem, possibly, right? Like whether it's I hate poetry or I don't understand poetry or I don't know what's going on here. And so I'm interested in the way that the poem is artifact and is this sort of, has this degree of artifice, right? It's kind of artificial in a way. We're creating, constructing this world or whatever it is within the poem, but we're also trying to represent something that is authentic oftentimes, right? We're sort of, communicating something and hoping, trying to communicate something that, has a degree of reality to it or truth or honesty or whatever that is, right? And so to me, there's a friction there between, I've got this world of the poem that sort of exists outside, but I'm also, sort of gesturing towards the reality of lived events and how do those things connect and how do you create sort of an authentic speaker and create an authentic experience for the reader, if that makes sense.
It absolutely does. And based on your experience and what you're doing now with your work, with the craft, how are you merging the two? And how can someone who's listening also balance and have that authenticity in their work?
Sure. I mean, in some ways, I've been thinking a lot about I guess it's a matter of voice in poetry a lot of times for me, like feeling like there's a sort of human speaker behind the poem, right? And there's no one way to, I mean, that's kind of a slippery notion, even this idea of voice in a poem and like who's speaking and the line between sort of like an oral voice, right? Like a spoken voice and the voice on the page and how that gets created or constructed. But I think that is what it kind of comes down to is sort of finding a way to capture sort of a voice or a perspective that feels, that feels true, I guess, right? That feels like it's coming from a place of truth in some way.
Mhm.
And I think there's a lot of ways to do that, so I don't know. I don't have a list necessarily of how to do that, but there are different approaches, right? I mean, a lot of the poems in this collection are very kind of narrative driven, right? And like that search party poem have dialogue in them even, right? Which maybe you don't always expect from a poem, but sort of different voices entering. Um, and other poems might be more kind of like, fragmented or lyric or whatever it is, but that still sort of find a way to kind of represent you know, the author's experience, the writer's experience, even if that's not even, what's being written about necessarily, right? Like feeling that there's that kind of guiding voice behind it, I think.
Absolutely. Which it makes me wonder for this particular collection, why prose poetry as opposed to another form?
But yeah, at the time, I thought there was some, or remember thinking that there was some kind of freedom in prose poetry, and not that I now think that's wrong, but I remember it just sort of made sense for me in my creative process at the time. I'd started out writing more, sort of lineated verse, traditional kind of line break poetry,
Mhm.
and there, something at the time had sort of felt the line breaks didn't feel like they were working for the poetry that I wanted to write, right? Like they weren't allowing me the space or the sort of freedom. And the prose poetry sort of opened up that world for me for whatever reason. I mean, I think that can happen. Sort of small changes can um, lead you in a different direction as a writer. So even, deciding like, well, I'm not going to write in lines. I'm going to try this as a prose poem, right? And that kind of it just made sense for these pieces, right? And I've since gone back and started writing more, poems with line breaks, and at times prose poems. But I think that's part of growing as a writer too, is sort of knowing what a poem might want or require as you're writing it and being sort of flexible and open to that process.
Can you take us inside your creative process? I know you touched on it a little earlier, but
Sure.
what does it look like when you begin to write a poem?
Yeah, I think for me, usually, I mean, I know I had mentioned when we were talking about Search Party, it sort of started with that image, right, or that character, and I think it's often it'll be one of two things. It'll be maybe like an image, right, or just sort of something that kind of sticks,
Mhm.
or it might even be like a phrase or a piece of language that kind of catches my attention in some ways. Oftentimes, it's something unusual or something that I've misheard, right? Like if I'm like those are always good starting places I find for poems when you sort of like don't quite accurately hear and the sort of mashup of language kind of sparks something and
Mhm.
that sort of starts you in a direction. So usually a poem might start there. I don't usually set out to write a piece about a certain thing necessarily. It's more kind of, starting with that thing that interests me and sort of seeing where it goes, I guess, right? Being willing to follow that, that image and what's it connected to and how does that get built rather than trying to arrive at a destination. And I do remember when I was writing the poems in this book, a lot of my process, I don't do this as much anymore, maybe because of, or time or process changing, but I would do a lot of sort of, I guess, free writing or automatic writing and just sort of try to fill a page or two and just sort of keep going without really censoring myself and seeing like even if it was bad or terrible, in the end, just sort of seeing like something would come out of it, right? And I'd be able to go back and find that sentence or two or phrase that sort of like, oh, that's something interesting there, and then kind of, you know, follow that a bit more specifically, right? So I think that that used to be part of my writing process that I don't seem to do as much anymore for whatever reason. It's a bit sort of slower, a little bit more focused after, finding hitting on that kind of idea or the core kind of I mean, it might not even be the core, right? It might not end up being the core of the poem. Maybe it starts in one place and it takes you someplace else. But
Mhm.
that starting point, I guess.
Yeah, that sounds like curiosity just pulls the thread through and you just let go and follow it.
Yeah.
Is it always prose poetry or do you change it? Does it ever become, oh, I have an idea, I'm focused, and it becomes a short story, flash fiction? How do you decide it's going to be a poem as opposed to a different form?
That's a good question. And a lot of these poems, I mean, the poems in this collection, right, kind of blur that line between flash
Mhm.
fiction and prose poetry,
Yeah,
right? So
they
it's
do.
yeah, I mean, I think yeah, I had there's a student who came to my office that she had read some of my book, and she was like, so what is a prose poem? And I kind of told her, and then she's like, but then you also have a poem in there called The Story of Mr. Kitchen. And I was like, well, yeah, that is true, actually, right? So that's something that the collection I think is playing with that boundary, right? And I
Mhm.
don't know that they obviously overlap in different ways, right? There's not just you can't just draw a line and say, this is a prose poem and this is a short story or flash fiction or a micro essay or whatever it is, right? Like they sort of all overlap in some Venn diagram, I guess, that that exists somewhere, the
Yeah, that's
best of the diagrams.
Mhm.
For me, because I was a poet, the sort of prose poem made sense to me, or I thought of myself as a poet, right? And one thing I think there are certain expectations for a reader as well, if you sort of call something a prose poem versus flash fiction, right? It might kind of create this. I don't know, like some expectation. Maybe like you're not expecting sort of a closed narrative, right? Or a beginning, middle, and end. Not to say that all stories do that either, but like it might set you up for, a certain type of writing, sort of allow for a little more. To me, to my thinking, the prose poem offers a little bit more kind of uncertainty or like the possibility of sort of magic in the world of the prose poem than flash fiction. But I'm not opposed to sort of I found myself writing prose pieces lately that feel a little bit more like essays. So I'm
Mhm.
kind of interested in um, seeing where that goes, possibly if that sort of if I were to sort of say like, well, all right, now I've got an essay on my hands. What do I do with that, right? And what decisions do I
Exactly.
make, right? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. How have you learned to protect your creativity while still showing up for the responsibilities of everyday life?
I think it does go back to that idea of curiosity.
Mm.
As we were talking about a little bit, my process isn't always that, everyday kind of sit down and write routine. So it's about sort of finding the time between those. And there are times, especially when, those other roles come into play where you're in the middle of the semester and, you're teaching students and grading papers and whatever it is. And, then you have to get, to soccer practice and that kind of thing that maybe not a lot of poetry is getting written, right? But
Right.
sort of, not kind of beating yourself up about that necessarily, because I think there are those ebbs and flows to it and sort of accepting that and being willing to sort of know that when you return to the page or the computer that you'll sort of it'll be there, right? Because you are
Right.
planning to return, right? You know that you will come back to it. So, um, in some ways, it's about keeping that curiosity, remaining flexible, and I think not being too hard on yourself.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's something that you wish you had learned early on in your writing career that you can share to help
Yeah,
someone.
sure. So in thinking about that idea of sort of having to learn the rules before you break them, right? Like one thing that I see that I think that I think was important to me as a writer early on was that how I was learning those rules, right? But I also had teachers and that were encouraging of experimentation, right? They were open to, sort of letting a poem, maybe, in some ways, maybe too much, like not necessarily make literal sense, right, at the moment. Sort of, they were open to sort of drafts that kind of went in a direction that um, tried something new, right? And a lot of times in teaching, I think I see students um, that maybe hold on to sort of like the idea that they're trying to get across in a piece of writing too tightly, rather than kind of maybe just sort of, you know, letting go of like sort of the destination of the piece or what you had in mind for the piece, and just sort of being open to the possibilities of a piece, if that makes sense, right?
Mhm.
Um, and I think that that was important to me. I was sort of given that sort of. I think I learned that from my teachers and from the poetry that they introduced and what a poem can do, and the different ways a poem can be kind of like exposed me to that sort of early on in my process. And going back to the idea of sort of what I would tell my younger self, I think it connects with that idea of the writing process these days, right? Is to sort of, not be too hard on yourself as a writer,
Mhm.
right? Like
Mhm.
the writer's path is, sometimes, kind of necessarily filled with a lot of rejection, right? Even the best writers will submit stuff and, get turned down any number of times, and you'll start things that maybe don't finish or don't turn out the way you expected them by the end, right? There's not a lot of certainty in writing, right? Even like sort of for good writers or great writers, you just still don't know how a piece is going to come together in the end. And I think if you do know how it's going to come together, then it loses some of the magic that might make it like a great piece, right? If you can sort of forecast at the beginning, like this is how it's going to turn out, then maybe there's not enough kind of invested in that. So just
Mhm.
sort of being, allowing that process to happen and not being too hard on yourself is sort of those ideas. Yeah, I think come back for me if I could tell my younger self.
If you could tell your younger self,
Yeah,
that's one of my
like
signature
take it easy
questions,
on
but you've
yourself.
answered it though, that's what you would tell your younger self. So that's wonderful. And what do you want your legacy to be?
And I hope that we started off the conversation with some of those titles, right? And those like a professor, a poet, author, that kind of thing. And that I hope I've made kind of an impact in those areas, right? I mean, I think one of the nice things about or one of the things that I enjoy about being a professor, right, is to have a chance to interact with students, right? I really enjoy that classroom time, and I get a chance to talk about sort of like writing and ideas and writers that I love and that I hope that they love, right, as well. And so I hope I have an impact there in some small way, right? Sort of the way that my best teachers have done for me, right? And I hope that as a poet that that my poems make some impact in some small way, like that poems I've read and experienced and carry with me have done for me in the past, right? So I think those I don't necessarily. Of course, there are, lofty legacies that you could dream up, but I think just having that kind of personal impact in some small way, whether it's on a reader or a student or whatever it is, I think is what I'd like that legacy to be.
Okay, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. What is one thing you're looking forward to? What's next for you?
So I am, kind of continuing to write poems towards a new manuscript. I do have sort of another manuscript that's already completed and finished, and that I'm submitting, and then this I'm on to sort of a third manuscript that I hope takes shape. And I've been doing some of that over the summer in terms of selecting poems and sort of figuring out what the manuscript needs.
Mhm.
So there is that sort of ongoing process. I feel like since I don't necessarily or I don't often or haven't yet, I guess, had a project type manuscript. For me, it's more often sort of writing poems and at some point kind of taking stock and seeing like, well, what are these poems all thinking about, right? Or kind of what makes sense, or how do they come together, right? So I'm in that process a little bit. I'm also excited. We were just talking about teaching. Um, that I'm developing a couple new classes for the coming year. So there's a
That's really nice.
poetry class about thinking about poetry in the public space, right? And like encountering poems off the page, whether that be kind of performance poetry or, you know, like Ada Lamone's National Parks project, where she put poems in the national parks for people to
Wow.
experience, or bus poetry or that kind of thing, or even like documentary poetry where you're interacting with a public document often to write your poetry. So it'll be thinking through some of that, and I've gotten started on developing that course over the summer, and I'm excited to sort of continue to do that and engage with some of that work with students in the fall.
Yeah, that's exciting. Very exciting. And do you have any advice for our listeners? Anyone who's listening, who wants to walk in purpose? Any advice?
Any advice? I was, in terms of, I think this kind of goes along with some of our conversation in terms of, being flexible and not being too hard on yourself. I was giving a reading a month or so ago, and a student, or I assume he was a student, a young man had asked me a question after the reading about writer's block, right? And he's like, sometimes I get caught up and I don't know how to keep going with a piece, right? And so I was trying to give him some advice about that. But one of the things that I told him was, sometimes it's those small things that can make a difference, right? And I don't know if it's maybe practical advice, but I told him, what works for me sometimes is I buy a new notebook, right? Like that's, I often write my poems sort of longhand or that's where they start, kind of
Oh,
keep
really? Okay.
and I found myself, for a long time, I always bought the same size notebook, right? And I was like, I write this, I like these notebooks. And then at one point I was like, I need, a bigger notebook, right? Like, and the poems sort
Right.
of, and that small change kind of let the writing unfold in different ways when you're not reaching the end of the page as quickly, right? You sort of come up with more words to fill the page, and you think about sort of the writing process in just a slightly different way. And so I think it's not the big things. It's not sort of life-changing, actions that you have to take, but you can do sort of at least take these small measures or small changes to kind of just sort of reframe your attitude towards the creative process, or your point of view, and that can open new possibilities.
Well, thank you, Patrick. Thank you so much for being on the show, and I hope you'll come back again.
I would love to. This was great. Thanks so much for the conversation, Nicole.
Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. I hope you left feeling inspired and energized to follow your own path with purpose and creativity. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and until next time, keep creating, keep dreaming, and keep living your purpose.